That's on. Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History is Lunch program, which is sponsored by the John and Lucy Shackelford Charitable Fund of the Community Foundation for Mississippi. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium, in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, and we're streaming live on both Facebook and YouTube, where those videos are available to watch anytime afterward. And if you've not already done so, please silence your cell phones. The special exhibit Solidarity Now, the 1968 Poor People's Campaign, is open upstairs. The traveling exhibit explores that pivotal grassroots movement and examines the 6-week protest community in Washington, D.C. that called the nation's attention to the effects of poverty on millions of Americans. The exhibit runs through September 24th. It's organized by the Smithsonian Institution Traveling Exhibition Service in collaboration with the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and it's supported by the CVS Health Foundation. I hope you'll all get a chance to see that. And some of you may remember that last year for History is Lunch, the filmmaker Roderick Red screened clips from the documentary Promised Land, a story about Mound Bayou. The full film will be shown here in the auditorium at 2 p.m. This Sunday, July 9th. And Dr. Matthew Holden, who is the consulting scholar on that project, will give a presentation on the life of Isaiah T. Montgomery afterwards. So join us for that. I promise we'll crank the air conditioning. I hope you'll join us next week for History is Lunch, when Elizabeth Bronwyn Boyd will present Southern Beauty from Pageantry to Bama Rush. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Fitzhugh Brundage and Charles Reagan Wilson to discuss Brundage's book, A New History of the American South. W. Fitzhugh Brundage is William B. Umstead Professor of History at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He earned his BA in History from the University of Chicago and his MA and PhD, both in History, from Harvard University. He is the author and editor of many books, including Beyond Blackface, African Americans and the Creation of American Popular Culture, 1890 to 1930, Where These Memories Grow, History, Memory, and Southern Identity, the prize-winning Lynching in the New South, and Civilizing Torture, an American Tradition. Charles Reagan Wilson is Professor Emeritus of History and Southern Studies at the University of Mississippi. He earned his BA and MA degrees from the University of Texas at El Paso and his PhD in History from the University of Texas at Austin. Wilson's books include Baptized in Blood, The Religion of the Lost Cause, 1865 to 1920, Judgment and Grace in Dixie, Southern Faiths from Faulkner to Elvis, and most recently, The Southern Way of Life, Meanings of Culture and Civilization in the American South. His presentation to kick off this season of History is Lunch in January about that book was so good, it earned an unsolicited I love you from the audience. Top that. Help me welcome Fitz Brundage and Charles Reagan Wilson to the stage.
Thank you, Chris.
I won't be satisfied with any less than that reception.
Well, we'll see.
All right.
We'll see. Well, I have the big book here, New History of the American South. So we're all from Mississippi glad to have Professor Brundage here. He and I go back a long way and see each other often at the Southern Historical Association and other meetings, and we have a mutual research interest in collective memory of the South. But it's good to welcome him to Mississippi, and so we're going to talk about his book, a little bit about my book and our different approaches to the study of the South. But I want to
Thank you. Thank you.
There you go. So I'd like to begin by having him tell us a little bit about the genesis of the book and how it got started, how long it took, any challenges along the way, the usual.
Well, first I want to say what a privilege it is for me to be here, and I want to thank everyone here who's hosting me, but I also want to say what a privilege it is to have a conversation with Charles. Charles's work has been an important influence on me throughout my entire career, and so it's with great admiration and pleasure that I'm here. The origins of this work, which I edited rather than wrote the whole thing, unlike Charles's book. The origins of it had to do, came about in the UNC Press itself. The University of North Carolina Press was planning ahead to celebrate its 100th anniversary as one of the most distinguished university presses in the country, and arguably the most distinguished university press in the South. And so they invited me to edit a collection of essays about the history of the South. And the goal was to try to pull together the scholarship, the sort of synthesis of the scholarship that had been produced over the last 25, 35 years, and offer it in a concise, readable manner that was accessible to an audience beyond academics. So that was the goal. They actually asked me to do this in 2005. And I overheard Charles beforehand talk about the gestation of your current book was 1989. So I feel a little better that the book actually came out in 2023, but part of it had to do with what I was working on at the time. And then we had to get together, and Charles has done a lot more collaborative work than I have. It had to pull together all the authors. You got to get them at the same place. You got to get them on task. And we really got underway in 2016, and then COVID hit right when we would have been trying to pull everything together. And as you all know, it was very hard to ask anybody to be on a timeline during COVID. So the gestation took longer than I would have liked. But part of the challenge, and this was something Charles and I were talking to before, was as an editor, I wanted to make it so that you as a reader, if you pick up the book and you start on page 1, can read all the way to the last page of a many hundred-year history of the South, and not feel as though you're reading one voice to the greatest degree possible. And you know, when you get 15 academics to write, getting 15 academics to write in an accessible voice is a challenge in itself. Getting 15 academics to write without their usual, shall we say, voice, can also be a challenge. And a few of the authors really didn't want to bend and mold themselves, so that added to the length of time. And finally, there was a challenge. If you want to have a consistent voice and an argument, threads that are pulled all the way through hundreds of years of history, with historians whose specialty are different periods of time, they need to be familiar with each other's work. So the colonial, they don't like to be called early colonialist anymore, they like to be called early American historians. The early American historians had to write their section first so that the 19th century historians could read it. So if anybody was slow along the process, it meant everybody who followed was slowed down. This is all in the weeds to say herding 15 scholars is like herding 15 toddlers. And it takes as much time and stamina and patience, I think, maybe even more. So that's the process, if you will, and the challenge.
Well, congratulations. You overcame the challenge.
Thank you.
The use of the term new is quite striking. When I first saw the cover, and I thought of all the previous books that have just been called A History of the American South. So the use of the new is very striking. So what do you think is new about your book?
Well, I probably would have called it A History of the American South, as you suggested. But publishers, of course, are always interested in the new or some provocative element. But to a certain extent, I'm comfortable with it. I would like to be humble and not exaggerate the newness. But on the other hand, I do think to the extent that it's new, it does bring together and make accessible, I hope, for the largest possible audience, a lot of thinking about particularly the early period of the American South, and in some ways the 20th century American South. That's where I think in some ways it's freshest, and pulling that all together. So to clarify what I mean by that, when I went to graduate school, the field of early American history was still dominated by the New England scholars and Middle Atlantic. So if you went to graduate school in the 1960s, 1970s, into the 1980s, and you were studying Philadelphia, Boston, or New York City, or what became New York, you didn't have to explain why you were doing that. If in 1980 you'd gone to graduate school and you said you wanted to study the Choctaw in Mississippi in the 18th century, you could have done that, but your career, the idea would have been, well, that's very specialized. Whereas we're now in a period of time when the study of the American, what we call the American South, the colonial American South, is richer than it has ever been. The quantity and quality of the material is just superb. And the whole weight of the study of early America has shifted and is much more balanced than it ever was before. And so I think we wanted to acknowledge that and incorporate that openly into this history. And then I think with regards to the 20th century, we still haven't sort of worked through, I think, a narrative of the 20th century in the American South yet, in this book or elsewhere. That's still sort of in formation. But in the last 30 years, the shelf of books that existed on what we call the civil rights struggle now, or Black freedom movement, was a small shelf 30 years ago, and now you could fill the alcove of a library. So I think to that extent, the beginning and ending of this history are greatly transformed. In the middle section, the 19th century, I think what is newest about this is what we have foregrounded and what we have backgrounded. To clarify what I mean by that, it's not as though we have erased Robert E. Lee from this volume, but Robert E. Lee is not the pivotal paragon figure, if you will, of the 19th century section, or Jefferson Davis. Other figures have been moved to the foreground. And one example would be Scott Nelson has a chapter about the New South after the Civil War, in which he talks about Henry Grady. The Henry Grady who was the editor of the Atlanta Constitution and a very influential Georgia politician and intellectual, if you will. That's the Henry Grady who we're all very familiar with. And then there's this other Henry Grady who is a very obscure, working class. He wasn't a Southerner, but he was in the South, who traveled across the South, working in lumber camps and railroad camps. And it's a very different portrait of the South. And that would be an example of how we changed what we foregrounded and backgrounded in the story.
You mentioned about the three parts, which raises the question about periodization, which is something historians always have to deal with. And you were in the introduction saying this is always a frustrating thing because there's no perfect solution to it. But it is striking that you have the first part coming up to 1800. When I was in graduate school, even before you were in graduate school, it's the same story about the Native Americans, that they were not a part of Southern history. And Southern history began with Jamestown in a sense, but it really began in the 1830. That was like the dividing line we all learned. And there's some truth to that because a lot of important things happened in the 1830s. But tell us a little more about periodization and how you worked through this, that early part. Robbie Etheridge, who wrote that first chapter, used to teach, she taught at the University of Mississippi, just retired this year, and I team taught a course with her, and I learned from her, when you talk about the South, always talk about Indians, always. And so that had really affected me. But she had, the first chapter really is about prehistory, and she uses the term antiquity. And it was so fascinating because when most of us think of antiquity, we think of Europe, and the ruins of the classical age or something. But it's very striking that she puts that, recognizes, it's like an act of discovery on Robbie's part that we all now share. But anyway, tell us a little more about your thinking about why those three kind of divisions and turning points.
The decision was both practical and heuristic, I'll put it that way. And I'm glad you bring up Robbie's essay. She has a wonderful title for hers, which I haven't seen elsewhere. Maybe she has used it elsewhere. The first chapter of the book is called The Ancient South, which I just, we're so used to the Old South and New South, and to have the Ancient South established as a category is wonderful. But I think the idea was, as I mentioned, this was a collaborative effort, both a collaboration that I was organizing, but also overseeing smaller teams and the team of colonial early American historians. One, we wanted to make sure that the story of Native peoples and what we call the American South was clearly foregrounded. But there was also the idea that from pre-contact to, we'll say, roughly 1800, the range of possibilities for how the South, again, what we call the South, might have developed are so wide open, and that what is the Mississippi River Valley region might well have gone off in not only different imperial directions, remained part of the French Empire, less likely part of the Spanish Empire, or Native peoples might have remained dominant for a variety of ways. We saw that as extending in, we'll say, up to roughly 1800. At the same time, the 19th century team was told to go back to roughly 1880 and think about pulling that story through so that the Native peoples aren't erased all of a sudden in 1800, or for that matter, although to a lesser extent, in 1830. So the periodization was in part, as you suggested, a reflection of the contingency of American control over much of what is now defined of as the South in 1800. The 19th century, we thought of the long 19th century, so that team was supposed to go back to about, we'll say, 1780 in the American Constitution, and thinking to the early 20th century. And the 20th century team was supposed to start roughly 1890 and move up. So they're in some ways they reflect familiar periodizations, but within those the long colonial period, the long 19th century and the long 20th century, we wanted people to feel free to adopt whatever chronology they thought appropriate. And there, I think, one thing I'll note that's interesting is when you get 15 historians together and they work with chronology, colonial historians and 20th century historians are quite comfortable moving across time. 19th century historians, at least those that I've worked with, tend to be, they either do the pre-Civil War, they do the post-Civil War, they don't move through that century the same way. But I'm getting in the weeds.
So you mentioned about Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis in the Civil War, and you have wonderfully foregrounded new figures, that we don't often have read about or heard about, like the second Henry Grady, which is so fascinating to have the same name and very different figure of a working class railroad man. But anyway, the point is about the Civil War. Traditionally the Civil War was the center of Southern history. Everything kind of went out from there. And it's true in my book, my Southern Way of Life book, I downplay the Civil War in a lot of ways. But that reflects the scholarship, though. So we're drawing both from that. But the last chapter is about the Black freedom struggle. So we're here adjacent to the Civil Rights Museum. Is it safe to say, or am I just being provocative, that the Civil Rights Movement has replaced the Civil War as the center of Southern history, a kind of culminating moment? There's no right answer.
No, I just think that's a very provocative question. My immediate response is yes. I think, and I offer this not as I'm not putting on a scholar hat, if you will. I'm just offering this as a contemporary citizen. I think, for example, undergraduate interest in the Civil War, there's always an audience for that, and appropriately so. I mean, it's a cataclysmic event in our nation's history. But the interest of graduate students, of undergraduates, and I think the broad public is as great or greater in the civil rights movement or the civil rights era, civil rights struggle than it is in the American Civil War now. So I think as a practical matter, that is now seen as the formation of the people we are, the nation that we are. Whereas, you know, in 1960, during the Civil War centennial, the Civil War was what made America. And I think that's becoming harder and harder for contemporary Americans to recognize. It's becoming not just more distant in the past, obviously, but also the connections between our present circumstances are becoming more tenuous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And I think you see it reflected in the trajectory of commemoration. You know, certainly there are many more Civil War sites and monuments than those to civil rights, but in the last 10, 20 years, civil rights museums, monuments have been escalating, and museums are a part of that story. You've written before about this, The Southern Past, one of your wonderful earlier books about museums in the past and the story, how they present history, Southern history in particular. But that's undergoing a really dramatic change in the narrative, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. And I'll just offer an anecdote about something else that this interest in commemoration, you said, is something that I've had for quite a while. And it's interesting to note that I've done work on commemoration in North Carolina. And North Carolina has, or had as of before the beginning of removal of Confederate memorials, had in the neighborhood of about 225 Confederate memorials. And the interesting thing is that since 2000 in North Carolina, more Confederate memorials had been put up since 2000 than had been taken down. But the interesting thing about the Confederate memorials that have been put up since 2000 is almost all of them have gone up on battlefields. Only a few have gone up on public sites. So even though the number of monuments to the civil rights movement, for example, is tiny in North Carolina, those have gone up in public space. So there are still Confederate monuments going up, but they're going up in private space. And the new commemoration, if you will, is not to the Confederacy, but to the civil rights movement or to noted black, women, Indians, etc. Well, I want to shift conversations briefly here to talk about this question of the proverbial question of Southern distinctiveness. And I want to raise this because I would really like to hear your thoughts, having read this collected work, and also reflect on your own book. And just to say briefly what I tried to do in the introduction was to explain that when I got together this I'll call it stable of scholars, I didn't say to them, let's identify what makes the South distinctive and trace that history. Instead, my thought was, that's a fool's errand, because the South of 1700 was not the South of 1800, was not the South of 1850, was not the South of 1900 or of 2000. And so if we were to identify something in 1700 and trace it as though that was the organizing character of the peoples who lived in the South, we would necessarily leave out, we would have to shoehorn in lots and leave out even more. So And I know this just because there's been a review comparing this volume and a glowing review of Charles's book that I've read. And I don't have a problem with the author thinking more highly of Charles's work than this book. That is not my concern at all. It's just the author said that I downplayed Southern distinctiveness in a way. And instead, what I think is that Southern distinctiveness is present, and it's crucial to our interest in the region. But it's not a continuous, there's not a continuous identifying element. So what made Southerners in 1800 is different in many, many ways from what would define a Southerner in 2000. And not just the obvious ways, some more subtle ways. So that's why we didn't use it as an organizing principle in this book. If you read the book, you won't find a moment where the contributors say, this is when the South became the South. That wasn't our organizing principle. So I was just wondering, how did you deal with Southern distinctiveness in your book?
Great question. I think my book is all about trying to understand how so many people got to think the South was distinctive. You know, what function did it fulfill? And my argument was that the Southern identity, the Southern way of life is really about regional consciousness and Southern identity, and that evolved. That was never static. It was always contested and contingent on a lot of things. And so first, Europeans and then Americans, Southerners themselves, used the term Southern civilization to talk about it very grand. And there you see the function of distinctiveness is to ennoble white Southerners in a contested time where they're living in a world of conflict with the North that leads to the Civil War, and also an unstable slave society. And so that idea of Southern civilization was a very ennobling one. And so I tried to do that in each time period. The Southern way of life in the early 20th century became the tagline, and that was again to, I'll take my stand, the Southern agrarians are focusing virtue on the older South of agrarianism. Anyway, so I think that, as you said, the distinctive South is always there. One of the differences from our books, I think, is I'm much more obviously interested in culture. And you have some wonderful material on culture. Paul Harvey, who is a wonderful historian, and he was charged with doing an essay on religion and culture, and he very skillfully combined both of those. And but anyway, he talks about cultural production, which I think is a great term, and the South has been the home of very distinctive traditions in music and literature and folk art and other things. But so I think those traditions are there, but partly it's also how you use those or think of those compared to other aspects. My book is really very long in time period, from the colonial period to the 21st century, but it's very narrow in theme. I'm just looking at these ideas. Your book has so much more on the economics and politics, and so I think they're complementary books myself.
Well, yeah, and that's certainly how I would like to think of it. One of the challenges when you think about Southern distinctiveness is, and this is an experiment you may have had in your own, or an experience you've had in your own life, but I've certainly experienced it personally. Personal background, just my father was from Illinois, my mother was from Virginia. So there was a clash of civilizations there. My father looked upon Virginians as this very exotic group of people. My mother's family were from Northern Virginia, rural Northern Virginia. And I always thought of us as being sort of middle Atlantic people, because our world was Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, Richmond. That was the triangle they lived within. I went to school in Chicago and Boston, and there I was a Southerner. People said I had a Southern accent, which I'd never known in my life. I'd never heard it, because I'd heard people with real Southern accents, what I thought. Then I taught for 1 year at University of Georgia, and there I was a Yankee. Because, of course, Northern Virginia isn't part of the South, and Boston, God forbid. Then I taught in Canada, and there I became the living embodiment of Southern exoticism. Then I taught at Florida, and you know what Florida's like. It's not clear what civilization exists in Florida. And now I'm at University of North Carolina, and all of these moves, the definition of the South, in the eyes of the people I'm with, has changed. And now, when you're in Mississippi, everybody puts Mississippi in the South. But then there are there's still, you all know in Mississippi, there are definitions of, you know, the Delta is very different than the Piney Woods, et cetera. So that's where the South is always has to do with where you're standing at that moment in time. And in a sense, that's the organizing principle we adopted in the book. And that who a Southerner was that's an incredibly challenging question to answer at any historical moment in time. So we adopted a very simple, but I hope justifiable solution that this is the history of people who live in the region that we think of as the South today. So that means we're interested in indigenous people who lived in what is now Arkansas, long before they ever thought of themselves as being part of the South, let alone the United States. So it's kind of evasive, but in other ways it was an effort to ensure that we could include all of the people who have lived in this region to the extent that we can. And so it wasn't, again, I think your point about Southern distinctiveness as being present and being embraced by people in the region is fascinating. And for some study of the South, it's of course crucial. But in other ways, if it's overemphasized, and I'm not by any means suggesting that's what you do, but it can become a case where, think of the classic work W.J. Cass's, The Mind of the South, an enormously influential work of the 1930s. That's a book that can tell you a lot about the mind of some Southerners, but it's not going to tell you about the mind of most Southerners.
Yeah.
I leave it there.
I think we all, in academia, but also in our general culture that we live in an age of expanding diversity in the United States and in the South. And the South is very much at the center of that. We're not on the periphery of that change. But has it caused, do you see this reflected in the historical essays that wanted to pay more attention to diversity in the past than was typical, and get away from the idea there's one Southern type?
Well, and there I'll confess, as the conductor, if you will, of a collection of scholars like this, there's what I would like to have done, and there's what they chose to do, and I respect what the individuals chose to do. There's more we could have done and should have done, perhaps. But again, I'm the conductor, and that's not to relieve myself of the burden of having tried to do that. But I do think the pluralistic South of today is more remarkable than we fully appreciate. And this really came home to me when I was teaching a collaborative course with a film scholar and a music scholar and me about the South. And he was showing clips from recent movies about the South that I confess I've not gone to a movie theater since COVID. So I haven't seen a movie, and for other reasons, I'm not up to date on recent movies, tragically. In any case, he showed a movie about by a Korean American director about a Korean chicken sexer sexes newborn chicks at an Arkansas chicken processing plant. You may know this film, I can't think of its name right now. Anyways, I was unaware this movie was made. It's just a remarkable movie. We showed Mississippi Masala in the class. It's a wonderful movie. But those would be just two examples a kind of diversity that truly has happened with lightning speed. I'll just use the example again in North Carolina of Cary, North Carolina, a suburb of Raleigh, which now has a very substantial South Asian population. And so Bollywood stars come and perform in Cary, North Carolina. And I can tell you, in 1985, you couldn't find an Indian restaurant in most of North Carolina, whereas now they're abundant, and there are not just Indian grocery stores, but there are Indian, I'll call them supermarkets on a grand scale. That's an extraordinary transformation. And one that I think we've barely, to throw out another anecdote about the scale of that transformation. When I first, 20 years ago, when I first started teaching at the University of North Carolina, the student body was, of course, by law, overwhelmingly North Carolinian, but it was overwhelmingly white North Carolinian. We now have a very substantial Asian American student body, a substantial Hispanic student body, so that classes are no longer, they probably still are majority white, but it's almost at a tipping point. And that's in 20 years. It's just a remarkable change.
I asked your former colleague at Chapel Hill, John Shelton Reed, one time about what he predicted about the future of the South, and he was thinking about Latinos and said, I would say, "Como está, y'all?"
We in the Triangle, we have to be grateful because grocery stores, restaurants,
yes.
music, there's just, the impact has been very positive.
Well, what is your, you say you shouldn't say play favorites with your children, but these are just historiographical essays. Do you have a favorite? I won't tell anybody.
Well, no, you mentioned Paul Harvey's. Paul Harvey's
Yeah.
is wonderful. It's playful.
Yeah.
It's provocative. It's creative. I also really like Peter Colclanis's essay, which is a kind of economic overview, because, and this I'll come back to a point about collecting scholars together. When I was soliciting participation in this, I was interested in. We were mid-career then. We're not mid-career anymore. Pretty soon we're all going to be retiring. But the gestation back, we were mid-career, so it's like people who haven't, these ideas weren't sort of fixed in their mind. This was an occasion for them to play around and have a conversation and develop ideas. In any case, I was really concerned about people who had a strong authorial voice, who I was confident could write engaging prose. So that was as important as their particular specialization in most cases. But what was interesting, and this you implied this, and I'll state it, is this ends up being, I would say, a materialist history of the South in a lot of ways. There is less cultural history than I would have expected. And that may partially reflect me and that I unintentionally selected scholars like that. We could have our exchange about Faulkner, for example. I'm one of those who, I look forward to the day when undergraduates don't study the South through Faulkner anymore. But I realize this is a dangerous thing to say in Mississippi, but that doesn't mean there aren't other great Southern writers, but it's just Faulkner in particular. In any case, I was surprised at how, especially in the 19th century section, it is a much more political, I'll call it social, to an extent economic history, but it's political social history, much more there. So that surprised me, and that's where These were the author's decisions, and I acknowledge them. And I don't know whether that reflects the drift of the scholarly community or just the particular collection of authors I brought together. And that's where, of course, your book I would love to think of your book as a complement to this. That would be a privilege. But in any case, the value of your work on culture is really important.
I think thank you for that. I think the University of North Carolina Press did a great job of having our books on the same list, and because they do, I definitely think they supplement and complement each other. All right, I think we wanted to leave some time for questions and comments, so. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I have two questions and one suggestion that I want.
I'll give you the microphone so everybody can hear you.
Yeah, I have two questions and one suggestion which I want you to respond to. Let me just offer the suggestion first. The puritization of the South may well have been and still is an ideological matter. Okay, that's my suggestion. The first question is in light of your anecdotes about the changes, the demographic changes. You mentioned South Asians in North Carolina. Very good case study, I think, up there. In light of those, is the South any less a white idea in the 21st century than at any other period of time? The second question is this. The facets Supreme Court made a decision last week that impacts not only UNC. Of course, if you go look at the data, then the data is all faulty. USC has at least a 22% Asian enrollment. Black enrollment is about 10%. I suspect that black enrollment has been right there for at least a decade, right? So, here we are. And North Carolina is a great example. The Research Triangle is a great example of what we will likely understand in terms of development. That's a whole other question too. But anyway, how do you look at both the short-term and the long-term impact on not just UNC, but also the political economy, the larger political economy in that region and also the South as well?
First, let me, and I certainly want to hear what Charles has to say about this too, but let me address your question about the idea of the South as a product of white ideology. I'll offer an anecdote about that. I have colleagues who have decided they're not going to teach courses with Southern in the title, because undergraduates perceive those courses to be about the white South, if you put the title "the South" in it. And I understand why. And that's not the way I teach. That's not what I want to teach about. But as a historical legacy of the way in which the term Southerner and South was used for a long time, Charles could speak to this, I'm sure, that's a popular perception. And so to the extent that I have any way of addressing that, is I try to be very careful in talking about white Southerners and black Southerners, not just together, but also whenever I'm speaking about who's the generator or who's the actor, it's always very important to acknowledge that. And lastly, I do think it's also a challenge in this moment in time, because black scholars are insistent that the history of the South is the history of the United States writ large and vice versa. And so black scholars often aren't interested in being put into, if you will, a kind of straitjacket of talking about the South as opposed to American history, the black experience in the United States. So I think it is a challenge, in other words, to address the question you raised and to figure out how to address it in a way to make clear that the idea of the South has been a product, or the most potent ideas about the South have been a product of the white imagination. and white ideology, but that there are still ways we can profitably talk about the South apart from that white ideology.
Yeah, the idea of the South was white generated. African Americans were important, formative cultural force in the South. And one of their contributions in terms of the Southern identity was to critique it and to criticize it and to show its failures. Although I was attuned in writing to find African American voices that would claim a Southern identity. One of the people I discovered is Horace Mann Bond, who is well known in African American educational quarters. He was Julian Bond's grandfather, but not well known in Southern history in general, I think. But he wrote an essay. Pardon? Yes, father. And so he wrote an essay in 1930 in response to the Vanderbilt agrarians, basically that I am a Southerner too. And now I think the most interesting discussions about the Southern identity are by African American writers. And we have several in Mississippi. One is Jesmyn Ward, who's won 2 National Book Awards. And she writes about South Mississippi, and she's staying there because she loves it there. And she said, these are my people. And her African American community is there, and she writes about the community. She's a rigorous voice of political criticism toward the Mississippi political leadership. But she combines that with a love of the South. And that's the new paradigm to me about where the most interesting discussions about the idea of the South now are coming from African Americans who are reimagining the South. It's no longer that white South that they talk about when they claim the South. I have an extended section about hip-hop, because hip-hop is full of images about the South, and the sounds are of the South, going back to soul music. So anyway, I think Casey Lehman, Jackson's own, is another similar voice who can be very harsh in his discussions about white culture, but at the same time, he recognizes the commonalities of Southern culture across these kind of racial lines. You know, white Southern state governments tried to segregate the South, but they couldn't segregate the eardrum, and they couldn't segregate the palate.
Right.
And so the food and the music and all of these cultural forms are really a product of this joint interaction, which that is an important concept for you, I think, in the book, this kind of interaction that was never recognized. You know, one of the challenges in the contemporary South is to name it and to say it. This is a long historical process, and we're at a culminating point, maybe, in terms of recognizing that.
I'd just add to what you were saying. I think you mentioned the palate. The transformation in the understanding of Southern foodways in the last 30, 40 years is just profound as well. And the reclamation, if you will, of Southern foodways by black chefs, black contributors is really conspicuous. And that challenges the old idea of the South. As far as what the recent Supreme Court decision means for UNC and the nation at large, I can't tell you how worried I am about that, in part because the leadership of the University of North Carolina has been cowed over the past decade by a whole series of misfortunes, I'll put those in air quotes, at the University of North Carolina itself. So there's a particular environment there that makes it unlikely that we'll see a innovative or courageous response on that campus, on my campus, or the campus where I work. But more broadly, I'm confused about what the future looks like. I'm a historian after all, so I'm not a prognosticator. But on the other hand, there's such momentum on campuses, just as a practical reality of the pluralism in American society, that I wonder, I do wonder if it's possible for a Supreme Court decision to hold back what is happening in American society. It can slow it down, it can interfere with its organic evolution, if you will. But I know one thing, UNC's student body is going to continue to diversify one way or another. It's just the demographics. That's a fact. That's I honestly don't know, given the legislature in North Carolina and the power that the legislature has over university governing boards in North Carolina, I don't know how campuses can respond in this environment. So I'm sorry I don't have a better answer.
Professors write for a variety of reasons. At the law school, we say that one of its primary purposes is to inform your teaching. How have the two of you used your scholarship to make the teaching of history alive and exciting for your students to move beyond events and dates?
Well, your question assumes that I actually succeeded doing that. Hey, I use every trick in the book. Back in the day, I used to be called Hollywood Brundage, because if there was a movie I could exploit, I did it. I'll just throw out one example. I have, about 15 years ago, I stopped teaching the U.S. survey. Not because I didn't think the U.S. survey was important, but because I realized that students who have endured APUSH, AP U.S. history, APUSH as they call it, if they've survived that, they probably never want to hear about Millard Fillmore, the know-nothings ever again in their life. So I tried to think of a way to teach them what I want them to know, but in a way that they won't recognize. And so I created a course called The Social History of American Popular Music, in which I use music, and I'm not talking about lyrics as much as I am talking about the social communities that create music, the musicians who create music, the business of music, and the commercialization and distribution of music. So I talk about the world of professional music as a way to talk about consumerism in American society, as the way to talk, as Charles mentioned, the ways to talk about race and segregation in American society, as the way to talk about industrialization and technology in American life. So I don't get to teach about foreign policy per se in a conventional way by doing this, but I get to teach about most of the themes that I'd like to teach about modern American history, and they think they're taking a course about pop music. So that's how I do it. I try to camouflage the cod liver oil that I'm giving them.
Some of the same techniques, a lot of films, a lot of music, and get them out of the classroom and take them to the museum. Ole Miss has a great folk life collection, so take them there and talk about this genre. Take them to Roanoke, and talk about Faulkner at Roanoke, so you get them out of the classroom. Do a lot of oral history, teaching about oral history, and assign a lot of memoirs to give that individual experience, to get at the diversity of the Southern experience by looking at particular people and their experiences. The most popular book of any course I taught, whether it was Southern Religious History or Introduction to Southern Studies, was Will Campbell's book, Brother to a Dragonfly. And that book told students some really unpleasant things, but it was so engaging, and combining the story of his role as a poor rural Southerner and the Depression and World War II, and sweeping through all the Southern history, and then his role in the Civil Rights Movement, all of this, combining that with the story of his brother, who eventually dies. So that kind of book was very engaging. And then would have them, as one of the assignments of the semester, was to do oral history with someone in their family. And so just a variety, as Fitz was saying, a variety of techniques and it communicates important things about Southern culture, and Southern life, I think.
You were talking about monuments in North Carolina. Do you have anything about the burning in Wilmington? Any monuments about that?
Yes, we should give Wilmington considerable credit for having commemorated, if that's the right word. No, that's not the right word. I'll say memorialized the 1898 coup. On the 100th anniversary of that, there was a grassroots community effort. In the face of some substantial opposition, as you might imagine, from some people who said, why bring up this bad old history, and other people who didn't like it being brought up because their ancestors were directly responsible for it, and they're still prominent figures in the community. But in the face of some opposition, they have created not only a substantial public memorial, they've also put up markers so that you can see some sense of the scale of the devastation of that 1898. It's sometimes called a race riot, but it wasn't a race riot. It was an attack on the black community of Wilmington. So there has been an effort, there was an effort on the 100th anniversary, but it's also now incorporated into the local history museum, which is a pretty good, fair to say, quite a good local history museum. And I think it is now a permanent, permanent might be too strong a word. As a historian, I know how nothing's permanent, but it is certainly very much a present part of the identity of Wilmington. So I think that's one instance where a community has made some significant strides to acknowledge a very tragic past and a very violent past.
At a couple of points where you've talked about diversification and Southern identity, and I've distinguished in my own mind between the high-growth South, the Research Triangle, the Atlanta area, and the low-growth South, like here. So could you comment a little bit on, is it still one identity, and how are these trends separating the region?
Well, and that's where I think then, I'm sorry, I haven't put this in properly, and I don't want to mess around with it with the sound on, because I'm sure I'll make a racket. But that's where I think Charles's work is really very important. You're spot on. The two Souths, there are many Souths, but as you say, the low growth and the high growth South. I think in the high growth South, places like the Triangle, the acknowledgement of Southernness is selective, and I'll even say almost by choice. So restaurants in the Triangle may play up their Southernness to the hilt. Barbecue, Southern cuisine, etc. Or they may not, they may go the other direction. But you can also live in the Triangle and not hear an identifiable Southern accent for hours or days on end. Just again, an anecdote. My wife and I have a toddler who we've done all the childcare since COVID, and we're always trying to think of things to do with her. So we go to Greensboro, we go to Burlington for these places to take her to do something, and we're always commenting on, you can tell we're outside the Triangle because the accents change. 20 miles, and the accents change drastically. So the boundaries are often not just between, say, the Triangle and Mississippi, it's the Triangle and 20 miles away. And yet even there, though, I'm struck by, we can go 30 miles south of Chapel Hill or it's a little further, Sanford, North Carolina, or Siler City, North Carolina, and this is the other South, the low-growth South, chicken processing plant South, and it's Guatemalans and Mexicans who predominate now in the school. So that's where I think even the low-growth South can have changed in ways that are just extraordinary. But I certainly think you're right about that divide, and that divide can play itself out not only in cultural politics and in politics, but also in a sense of the ways in which those parts of those states interact with each other, which I've seen in Virginia very drastically. People who don't live in Northern Virginia consider Northern Virginia to be occupied territory.
I agree with you that hopefully Faulkner will no longer define the South. I think the author Ralph Eubanks is a great candidate for doing that. He's an excellent writer. Looking at a list of the contributors for the book, how many of these are non-male white? Does that make sense? I don't recognize the names.
That's a very good question. And I'll also say somebody who I think could be a great person for people to start with is the poet Natasha Trethewey.
Mm-hmm.
She's, if you want to get into Southern history, she's a great way to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And she has Mississippi roots, right?
She is from the coast.
Yeah, I thought so.
Eubanks is more of a scholar on the level of Faulkner.
Right, right. So about the contributors, and I tread carefully here because how people become contributors is, there are a variety of reasons, personal reasons involved. But one of the challenges, as I alluded to before, was I asked a number of black scholars to contribute, and they didn't want to, some had career reasons, a variety of reasons, but some didn't want to because they didn't want to write about the South. They wanted to write about the African-American experience without having to pay attention to the conventional boundaries of region that way. And so that is a challenge. But to a specific answer, there are two African-American women contributors. There's Martha Jones and Blair Kelly. Blair Kelly's the incoming director of the Center, she wasn't at the time, but she's now the incoming director of the Center for the Study of the American South at UNC. And Martha Jones is a professor at Johns Hopkins University. And she's written, she's perhaps best known for a wonderful book on birthright citizenship. The other contributors, there are, and here again, there are complications. There were other contributors who were going to participate and then life circumstances happened and they dropped out. But as far as there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 white women contributors to the collection. And the rest are white males.
I don't want to be disrespectful, but do you, not but, I don't want to be
Right.
disrespectful. Do you understand that we cannot continue to tell the story of the South and exclude the black voice?
Oh, let me just say there was no intent to exclude the black voice. And the challenge was, how would I put this? The challenge was finding participants. That was the challenge. As I said, there are a number of scholars who they would have been happy to contribute to a volume on the history of African Americans, but they didn't want to contribute. It wasn't part of their career plan to contribute to a history of the American South. But no, I understand your point entirely.
It's not a criticism, it's just an observation.
And no, and it's one I'm keenly agree with.
We've gone a little past the top of the hour, but it was such a good conversation and discussion, I couldn't quite bring myself to not keep going. Thank you all for being here. Our good friend Betty Jo Harris heads up the Natchez Literary and Cinema Celebration. I can only imagine that on learning that Charles Reagan Wilson was going to be on stage today, that she rushed up in her vehicle with hand fans, his particular favorite, for the NLCC. I note there's a little space on the table where the books are being sold. Maybe I'll put these fans over there. And y'all can
Okay.
pick them up. Oh, look, we have books for sale. They're excellent. And both of our presenters today will be over there in just a few minutes. Thank you all for being here. Come back next Wednesday for Beth Boyd. Help me thank Charles Reagan Wilson, Fitzhugh Brundage for this excellent program today.